Ethical considerations. So for this class, we're going to be really focusing on the ethical consideration that you as an anthropologist have to take when you're going into research. So the first thing we need to cover is we got to think about cultures, particularly the culture that we live in, as a pair of eyeglasses that we see the world from. We are all raised to have specific views on life, depending upon the culture and society we are raised in. And our culture provides us with a lens to view the world around us and make critical and moral judgments. But again, as we've talked about before, this lens and how we view the world is not universal and can cause a lot of problems if we're viewing another culture through our own cultural lens. It may cause distortion. It's kind of like looking at something with the wrong glass prescription, right? You're going to see something very different than what maybe the people who are living there don't see. So whenever we observe or try to understand another culture, we really must be aware of our own cultural biases and beliefs. And this gets to the core of sort of the conversation between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So ethnocentrism is primarily about viewing another culture through the lens of our own culture and thinking of our own culture as the norm. So anything that is not our culture is seen as abnormal or even deviant or wrong. And also at the core, it also devalues other groups than our own because we're thinking of our group as the norm, as the way it should be, and everything else as being opposite or wrong. The other flip side to this is cultural relativism, which is primarily about evaluating a culture on its own terms and learning to see from the perspective of another in order to understand their culture, as well as being critical of making fast judgments on right and wrong. However, even with cultural relativism, there are questions that we need to consider. Is it always possible to practice cultural relativism? Meaning, is there a line to be drawn? Like, are there situations where we should be making a moral stance that this is right or this is wrong? And if there is a line to be drawn, where should it be? And unfortunately, these questions are always very much dependent upon the research and as well as dependent upon the researcher. But they're questions that every anthropologist must sort of ask themselves as they do research within any community. Another thing that an anthropologist must be really, really critical of is positionality. Being aware and engaged about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism doesn't mean that you cannot take a position about a particular belief or action, but instead it's confronting these issues head on and addressing your particular position in the research and being critically reflective of your cultural lens and personal beliefs. So positionality is about understanding the role and the effect of the researcher in the research. Researchers are not passive subjects, meaning that when I go into a field to observe someone or to interact with the community that I'm researching, I'm in a really big role, and I'm in fact very much an active actor in this. And a researcher's experience shapes, what she or he views as an important topic to study, right? And also, it's going to really affect how participants, so the people who they're studying, an anthropologist is studying, how they respond and interact with that anthropologist, as well as finally when the researcher uses the site and sort of reviews and looks at the data and writes about it. With positionality, we also have to talk about privilege. Privilege at the core is about understanding our social position in the research, and it's also about understanding our particular privileges and disadvantages in relation to the community we are studying, whether we are an insider or an outsider to a particular community. So we can study a community that we are actually an insider to, so such as our own church. We could study people who are going to that church or to that mosque or that synagogue And we're a member of that community. There are many sort of what we would call insider anthropologists doing research and ethnographic field research within a community that they are a part of. But even if they are insiders or somebody who's completely outside, who just comes in to study, you still have to sort of look at your privileges and disadvantages in relation to the community that you are studying. And it's also important to say that there is a privilege in being able to do research, meaning that there is a privilege in being able to have the time and the ability to do research on a particular community, whether that's your own community or an outside community. And to not recognize that privilege sort of erases kind of power differentials between you and the people that you're studying. We all have certain privileges and disadvantages depending upon the situation we are in. And these privileges and disadvantages will affect our interaction with our research participants, our observations, and our finished research product. These privileges and disadvantages also speak to ongoing social, economic, and political inequality that often marginalizes communities. Again, it's very much particular to the person who's in that site. Ethical considerations. So regardless if you're doing research outside of the United States or in your own backyard, in the community that you are from, you must address the impact of your involvement and research on that particular community that you're researching. Anthropologists should really try to protect the physical, social, and psychological well-being of those whom they study, and to also respect their cultural rights, interests, sensitivities, and privacy. Anthropologists should also be very sensitive to the possible consequences of their work and should endeavor to guard against harmful effects, so the harmful effects of their research or anything else that comes from their research. Consent from subjects does not sort of absolve or remove anthropologists from their responsibility to protect the research participants. Anthropologists should also be aware of the intrusive potential of their research. And what I mean by intrusive potential is that, as much as maybe some communities would welcome you to come and to record or to interact with them and to write about them, there is sort of an intrusiveness, meaning that, you into their homes, to their communities, and then leaving. It's kind of like, people coming over that you've never met before, and they're going to watch you cook dinner and then, leave. And, as much as maybe you might welcome them to come over to watch you cook dinner, it's still, a bit of like, there's still a lot of effort on your part to have them come over. You might clean the house, you might have to change some things around, you might need to get childcare. Again, you can't sort of, ignore the fact that when you do research with a particular community that you're also, putting a lot of obligations on them. And they may not be very strong obligations, but they also may be as well. So you have to really recognize that and respect and try to be as respectful as possible. And, and then also respect their right to privacy. Many people who might be participating in a study may want their names to be revealed, as well as sort of the right to their own sort of cultural beliefs and practices as well. So really much is about trying to not exploit the people that you're working with. And the reason why we're having this lecture today is because I know that the mini ethnography sort of information is now up this week, and you might be now starting to think about what to do for your ethnography. And so some questions that I want you to go and to sort of really think about as you're approaching and preparing to do your mini ethnography is that you need to be very reflective on your position in the research. So reflective on maybe the privileges or disadvantages you have in that research site, knowing that you're going to most likely do an ethnography that is within your own back door. You have to think about ways that maybe you are at a disadvantage in comparison to the people studying or observing, or as well as a privilege in comparison to the people that you're observing. You need to also be, if you're also studying something that is outside of your community, but even maybe within your community, you need to be aware of your cultural lens and your personal background that might skew your sort of analysis or sort of the conclusions you make from your ethnography. And also be respectful, right? Recognize that doing this research project, even though it is an assignment and even though you have to do it for a grade, it's still kind of a privilege to be able to do it in the sense that, you are coming into people's space to this project and to show adequate respect to the community that you are observing. Key terms: ethnocentrism, viewing one's culture as superior and applying one's own cultural value in judging the behavior and beliefs of people raised in other cultures. Cultural relativism, the viewpoint that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another culture. Cultural rights, a group's right to preserve its cultural practices, beliefs, and language. Positionality, a researcher's social, political, and economic role and effect in the research and the research community. And reflexive, reflecting on the position of the researcher in the research and the advantages and disadvantages of the researcher in relation to the research community. Thanks so much. See you in the next class.